loads of good issues to work through here. Attracting young people, future cities, training the workforce. Even Donald Trump got in there, so we can have a quick chat about him first. But I want to talk about productivity first of all. Sue, it's something you talked about. Are there any sort of practical examples or about why we're not as productive as other countries? Is it literally that it takes more people to build a bridge than it does in America? What does actually poor productivity mean, and why are we so bad at it?
Shall I have a go first?
Have a go.
Okay. I don't think it's one thing only, but I think it's a number of issues. If you look at, as a sector, if you do benchmark with others, they have actually invested much more over a prolonged period of time into skills and into innovation. And as I said, we've had a fairly survivalist business model driven through because of the recession. That's meant that actually those levels have been low compared to other sectors and some other countries as well. And I think also it's great to hear about the Highways England's viewpoint and the strategic network, but actually productivity has got to go well beyond that into the local network. And actually that is really challenging because at the moment you've got one client for the strategic network and you've got 153 in the local network. And actually, so you've got very different levels of expectation, contracts, and so on. So I think there's a variety of different ways. And I don't think we've focused on it. It's been something that we haven't really talked about and we haven't really challenged ourselves enough.
Amanda, well, I guess it feeds into the Quamby report, doesn't it? Should we be looking at more roads rather than just separating off trunk roads and council roads? Do you think that effectively, dare I say it, the local authorities, with their lack of money or whatever, are sort of letting everything down? Is that why the numbers are so low in terms of productivity? Not necessarily their fault, because they've had these big budget cuts, and Highways England gets a really good budget. But is that what's letting the side down?
It's interesting. I'm going to kind of answer your question in a slightly different way, if I may, because EY does a UK attractiveness survey every year. And it was interesting, particularly this year, when people, so in terms of FDI, so foreign direct investment, the number one thing that people were saying is like a trigger for investment in the UK was actually around roads. Interestingly, second, it was the London airports, and then thirdly, it was regional airports. So those were the kind of like the priorities. So I think for me, we have to invest in our roads, and where that investment comes from, whether it's actually at a governmental level or whether it's actually down at local authority level, it almost doesn't matter. But what we do need to have, and I think this is where National Infrastructure Commission has a real role to play, is to actually set the strategy for the next 30 years in terms of what is the overall ambition for infrastructure across the UK, and in particular, how do we kind of plan our cities and think about the connectivity between our cities to actually enable us to sort of compete on the world stage. Because I think, you know, when you've got cities like Shanghai with 24 million people competing with nations like Australia, you know, for the UK to actually kind of still be in the game, we have to think about, yes, London is now a mega city, but I think things like the whole northern powerhouse and the connectivity that we need to have in that northern powerhouse and the Midlands engine are absolutely key.
Is it fair to expect councils to do it, though? They've got a lot on their plates at the moment, and they, you know, does the whole model need changing effectively? And you've just got to look at roads in one big lump.
And I think I'll kind of come back to what I said about the National Infrastructure Commission, because I think that's where you need this strategic overview about what is the strategy, how are we going to kind of get the most out of our investment here in the UK. So I think we need to have sort of public sector policy that's very clear and actually sets the agenda.
Is it a vision thing, or does it have to be money? You have to
well, it has to be backed up by money.
yeah. So you can have the vision, but
yeah.
Because Quamby isn't necessarily talking about, well, he's talking about funding some of it in a different way, isn't he?
Absolutely.
Richard, do you look at it sometimes and think, you look at Highways England and you look at councils, and then you know, work for this private company, and do you instinctively think that private is more efficient than these sort of bigger companies?
No, not necessarily. No, it's not at all. Because I see some very effective things going on in the public bodies, highways, HSD that we work for. What I think, just going back to your productivity point, I think it's very easy to mistake cost for productivity. And when cost is your only focus, then you might think you've got a good result, but you probably haven't. I think it's one of the key points I'd make. And that's when you start off with cost as your focus. For example, the design cost of a scheme will be anywhere between 5 and 10%, often less than 5 in roads. And when you focus on cost and bash that element down as small as you can, you might make your bit of saving on that point, like you make on all points in the supply chain. But the value that you've lost in what you might have gained through some smart ideas is just goes unnoticed. So I think there's a big difference between productivity, cost, smart thinking, and where and how you try to save cost.
If you improve productivity, say, by 20%, does that dig us out of a hole, certainly in an immediate hole? Is it enough to increase productivity, or does it also have to recruit people at the same time? Is it just a short-term kind of solution?
Well, if I can recall the numbers that I mentioned earlier, if the gap in transport construction staff is 55,000, whatever we say it is, and our base is off 160,000, then 20,000 gets us over half the way, 20% gets us over half the way there to that gap. So it's certainly a big part of the puzzle in my view.
And Phil, you talked a lot again about working with the supply chain. Do you sit down and talk to these companies about in ways to increase productivity? Are you open to innovation if they say, have you thought about this? Because what I've heard a lot today is that there are sort of companies and they struggle to get their innovative ideas accepted. Perhaps they don't meet a set of standards. There's lots of red tape. Do you think you're open to kind of companies coming up with great ideas that can increase productivity?
Yeah, I think what Highways England has done over the last few years is we have a lot of supply chain groups that are collaborative, that we work together and we share working groups so that all ideas that come to the table come, not from Highways England, but they come majority from the supply chain. There may be, do we accept and endorse them and implement this? There's probably more work to be done, but actually, if you see what we've done over the last 2 years, in a lot of ways, we lead the industry in collaboration and supply chain management in terms of visibility and giving them access to us and visibility of those ideas. But it's not a finished article by any means. So we do have an engagement council. We do have a collaboration board. There are probably 20 working groups that supply chain sit on, and they have an equal voice.
Okay, let's talk about attracting young people now. And Amanda, you had some pretty stark stats about how young girls feel about careers in engineering. And I have a daughter, and she instinctively, I suppose, veers away from some of the engineering stuff. And my son, and I have tried so hard to get her into cars, and we sit and watch Wheeler Dealers together, and she has no interest whatsoever. Are you trying to force people to do something they don't want to do? Is it ridiculous to say that a lot of girls just actually don't want to go into a career where you put on orange overalls and walk about in mud and lift heavy weights or whatever? Is that a ridiculous sort of sexist way of looking at it?
I think as a sector, I think we've got a perception issue. So, the stats that I mentioned there, that it's still perceived to be very male-oriented. And also, it's perceived to be that you're out there on the construction site. But I think actually that's where, wearing my professional body hat, we've got a real role to play to actually sort of myth bust some of that. Because, when you look at the skills that are out there in construction, you don't have to be out on the construction site. And I think, programs like Crossrail, it'd be interesting to see how many people saw the Crossrail programs that were aired on BBC. I don't know about you, but I found those truly inspirational. When you kind of see the big tunnel boring machine passing between the top of the Northern Line and the escalator within 18 inches, you kind of have a bit of a wow moment. Now, that needs precision engineering, it needs design, it needs, a lot of back-end thinking that isn't actually just about being on the construction site, but actually there was also a really positive portrayal of a number of engineers and surveyors and architects that just happened to be female that were actually part of that programme. I think we need to do more on that. I just judged for Jamie Oliver's Italian, a piece with Class of Your Own. It was cross-professional. And this is basically schools, 14-year-olds, putting together a design brief for a Jamie's Italian. And I only saw, there were 74 entrants, and I saw the final 4. And I have to say, they were absolutely stunning, and the level of thought that went into it. So I think we have to kind of stop being hung up about our individual professions and actually talk about the built environment and make that interesting to the next generation. The RICS awards, it was fantastic actually. Literally last year I had a headmaster that came up and he was part of the Class of Your Own programme. And he said to me, Amanda, I just wanted to kind of come up. And he said, I've just really got it. It's not about buildings even. It's actually about building communities and changing people's lives. So that's what resonates with that next generation. Tonight, I'm sort of whizzing back to London to go to the Women of the Future Awards and present an award there for real estate, construction and infrastructure. And we've got 5 entrants. You want to see them. The calibre of the entrants is absolutely superb. We need to put more role models out there so girls like your daughter can actually aspire and see that there is the possibility to have a really fantastic career in this sector. Personally, I've been in the sector 30 years. I would never go and do anything else. I absolutely love it.
Sue, how old were you when you first realised that was the kind of career you wanted? I mean, what was your experience of kind of going through school, and when did you sort of say, actually, do you know what, I want to go into transportation? Were you very young, or did it all come later on?
I mean, it's an interesting question, because when I was at school, I was actually exploring various careers, and I actually spoke to a chartered surveyor, actually, who told me it wasn't a career for women. So I didn't go down the RICS route, but what I did do is go off and do actually something else, and went travelling, came back, and I was broke. And the first job I got was in the built environment because they needed people. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing, but I went off and did something. And then actually, I've found that during that, since then, I've been really supported by my employers, by my colleagues, by my peers, and by my bosses, many of whom have been men. So there's something about actually then really encouraging someone to go for it. So I fell into it because I was broke and I needed to actually get some money. But just to go back, where do young people now look for anything via the internet? And I don't know how many of you have got daughters or even sons. If you go and look at Plotter World, which is Plotr, there is a transport world now. And it's all about telling young people about what careers they can have in highways, in rail, and so forth. So it's a collaboration between TfL, ourselves, CIHT, Highways England, no, HS2, and Crossrail. And it's a fantastic way, because if we think we can actually get to people physically in every single school, then we're deluded. But that's one way of telling. And it does all the things that Amanda's talking about. It sort of says, it's about creating communities. It's about opening up areas to regenerate. It's about driving down the environmental footprint of construction. And it's a fabulous tool. So we need to promote that far more as a way of actually encouraging more people in.
I'll throw this open to all of you. Is it possible that it's actually nothing to do with the industry? The rot sets in much earlier than that it comes down to subtle things that teachers might say at primary school. It comes down to what parents or dads might do, and perhaps they encourage a daughter to do one thing and a son to do the other. Is the damage done long before the industry can get anywhere near these people? What do you think, Richard?
I wouldn't like to pronounce on that. I think it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But I think one observation is my 6-year-old daughter likes to do nothing more than do stuff with me, like drill doors or do electrical stuff.
Yeah. So you
too
let
close
your
to electrical
6-year-old
stuff,
daughter play with a drill?
Well, I help her do it. We stand there and we do it together. So
yeah.
So
well, you're sitting watching the football.
Yeah. Well, I let them go on with all the DIY in the house. No, but I think that they are. My 2 little girls actually couldn't be more excited about doing sort of physical stuff like that. So I can't believe, I don't know, they might get to a certain age and just say, well, that's it now, Daddy, I don't ever want to do anything like that with you again. But I doubt it. They seem genuinely interested in it. So that's my experience.
Would anyone from the room like to ask a question? Yes, over the back.
Hi, Jack Simpson from Construction News. I suppose this is more kind of general question about skills. Is the CITB in its current form able to facilitate the step up needed to plug the skills gap? If not, how can it be reformed to ensure it improves performance?
Who'd like to take that one?
I think that's one for you, isn't it?
I'm not going to comment personally, but if you read the farmer report, he's got extremely strong views on CITB and what needs to be done to evolve it and improve it and to make things more effective. And I think certainly some of the recommendations in there are really worth thinking very carefully about.
I want to get on to future cities now, because Amanda did an excellent presentation about how everything is going to look a long time in the future and how that changes the job anyway. But I'm going to put the question to Phil. We haven't heard from him for a little while. Phil, is Highways England now really ultimately just focused on these sort of 5-year gaps, or is there work going on where actually they're looking 20, 30, 40 years in the future to how we're all going to live, to what we're going to need, and as a result to what kind of people they might want to employ in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So looking long term is the only option, and we are engaged in that with lots of different groups, supply chain as well. You've got to look long term, and we do have, so yes, we may talk about a committed RIS1, but that's only a financial spend. We are looking 20 years out, because you have to. There is no choice in this industry.
Richard, how about AECON? Because obviously you deal with Europe, but also the Middle East, India, and Africa. And we hear so much about India and Africa. Amanda's just got off a plane from India and is waxing lyrical about what's going on there. Is it too late? Are we going to be left behind by these countries, or can we basically get skilled people from these countries, or what? What's the is the damage done already, and we're already going to be overtaken?
No, I don't think so. I see, some of what I see about the UK is the obvious strength in terms of, the structure of the government, the structure of our law. That's actually a really strong, attractive point to a lot of the countries we work with. A lot of them work with English law. They find that a very attractive, very stable way of doing business. And I think that, that those are the sort of institutional things that actually slow down a lot of these countries that I go to that have really got a big infrastructure demand, sometimes, quite often, a bit of money to use as well. But putting those two together seems to be a big, even though the two big pieces there, putting those two together is a big challenge because of the lack of the government and procedural infrastructure.
Is it more trouble down the line, though? Because as these countries expand hugely, presumably they're going to be quite well-paid engineering jobs there as well, and it's going to be quite attractive to go and live there and build all this stuff for them, so we lose even more people.
Well, look, of course it is, and that's exactly what happened in the last recession, right? Everyone went to work on big projects in the Middle East because projects here dried up. So, as somebody in the panel said earlier, it's quite often a cyclical industry. So, I think that actually helps in terms of smoothing out supply and demand. Looking at it internationally rather than just in one country.
I suppose it ties in with India and Africa and so on, but let's quickly get on to Brexit, because Amanda, you talked about this and the problems that may cause. As I say, everyone I've asked today sort of shrugged their shoulders a bit when I sort of said, are you going to struggle to employ people in the future because they can't get visas or whatever, and no one seemed to think it was going to be a problem, but you do. You seem to think that this is going to be a real imminent issue for us.
Well, I think it's slightly different. I'd say that, we had a skills shortage. So if we were sitting here this time last year, we have a skills shortage. I think we have to be realistic that there is going to be an impact of Brexit on skills in this sector particularly. So I think we have to think differently, and it was kind of coming back to some of the things that Sue and Phil were talking about. That makes us, we're great innovators, so we have to think about how do we do things differently? How do we kind of be more productive? How do we use 3D printing? How do we use the supply chain? How do clients become more intelligent clients, and actually, rather than just buy always on lower price within the public sector, actually allow a margin to actually build in that innovation, so that we're driving the industry to innovate, so that we're actually using resources in a smarter and more effective way. You know, what's going to be the impact of BIM, and how can we start to really drive that forward to actually make significant step changes in how this sector works and operates. And I think for me, you know, Brexit's a really great mechanism for actually driving that innovation and change within this sector.
So you think we're going to have to find ways of replacing people, like actually thinking about educating people, but it's just not going to plug the gaps. It's got to come down to innovation. Doing things differently,
I think, is going to be absolutely key, and I think we need to do that anyway. So I think this just puts an increasing pressure on what we need to do. Okay,
to round up, I just want to go along the line quickly and say, when do you think the problems might hit? You were talking about a cliff edge earlier. Seems like we're in the problems now, but is there a point 4 or 5 years in the future when you can see HS2 is doing this, Heathrow might be doing this, the road system is going to be doing this, that is going to be a bad year? Has anyone looked ahead and come up with that kind of conclusion?
Oh, we obviously do our best to plan for those scenarios, and it looks like a relatively good mix to me at the moment, actually, where as certain projects tail off, other projects will pick up. So I'm not hugely worried.
You're quite optimistic about this. Actually, a lot of people aren't, but you seem to be, because we've seen with the rail industry how projects go on much longer than they're meant to, and then that sucks resources from elsewhere.
I think I'd probably add one thing, and that's something that Phil was saying earlier, that, you know, if I was to make one request of the public bodies, it would be along the lines of, you know, separate skills academies are not necessarily what I think we need. HS2 for several years now is essentially going to be very close to being a highways project in terms of its skills and demand on skills. So thinking of rail separate from high-speed rail, separate from highways, in terms of our skills academies and all that, is, for me, a lost opportunity.
Amanda, can you see an obviously nasty pinch point coming along?
Well, I think I'm probably in a slightly different place. So I think the next sort of 5 to 10 years are really critical, because there is a lag time in terms of actually bringing people through and training them and getting them to be effective within our sector and within the professions. And I think, you know, it's a little bit that you've still got this, I think Sue said it, you know, we've got this competition with almost other professions and other sectors as well. So it's not like because we're all fighting for the same resources, how do we get them to actually come in and work within our sector? So I think, you know, we've got the projects, they're the H projects, aren't they? It's highways, it's Hinckley, Heathrow, and I think, you know, we throw in there the housing mix as well. You know, there's huge pressures on the deliverability that needs to happen, and we need those skilled professionals.
So are you optimistic that we can solve this well enough to get this stuff built without things being delayed and cost spiralling and all the rest of it?
I think it's going to require a real step change. And we've, you know, all the speakers have actually said about different things that need to happen. But it's not going to happen if we continue as we are. And there is a crunch point coming up. I was in a meeting recently with the rail, the aviation, the highways sector, and we were all talking about needing to increase the numbers coming in and the types of skills. And when you pull that all together, we're all then in competition with each other, and that is just a small part of the transport sector. And Amanda's absolutely right. When you go wider than that, and you actually really, really look at what's in the pipeline, and I haven't seen anything that really maps all those different things and the peaks for construction and when it's going to come down again, apart from in some of the transport areas. But a lot of the skills that we actually need are transferable well outside of transport. And if you're talking about engineering, they will go elsewhere. They will go elsewhere. So I'm not as optimistic as my colleague down the line here, but I think we do need to, and I think this is where a sort of a skills and mobility passport is going to be absolutely critical. Identifying what skills all of us need, and then mapping that with the workforce to see when there's some capacity or spare capacity to move that around.
Great. We'll have to wind it up there because I know two of you have got to rush and get a train, haven't you? Go to London, hand out awards and so on. So apologies for that, Phil, for not finishing up on you. So thanks to our speakers, for the audience, and the various sponsors, Match Tech, the session sponsor, Thales for the glorious mind maps, ACOM, the electronic voting. So thank you, Richard, for that. And, of course, Mott MacDonald, who've lent the name to this fantastic theatre.